Namaskara and Namaskaram. Am I audible? Okay. So I'm grateful to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to engage with students on such a relevant topic. I'm grateful to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share space with Ms. Sudha Murthy, a legend, a living legend. And perhaps I think she's the perfect embodiment of the balance between Bharatiyata and Indianness. I wasn't aware of the journey of the founder of this institution, but frankly speaking, given what he's achieved, I think it's fantastic, it's stellar, and I think he himself is a huge role model for students here. And I don't say this because I've been invited, but I'm frankly astonished at what he has managed to accomplish in his lifetime. So congratulations. I think I've been given 20 minutes. Let me start with a small correction. As an intellectual property lawyer, one of the first things we are told is not to take credit for something that you're not. I am not a Rhodes Scholar, and fortunately so. I can either spend the next 20 minutes trying to speak and sell my books further, or I can say something that is relevant to the theme of the event and something that may be personally relevant to your individual journeys. When we speak of Bharat Unleashed, when we constantly use the word Bharat these days as a fortunate substitute and synonym for India, and a better synonym in fact, and when we keep speaking of Amrit Kal as defining and animating the next quarter of a century, what does it exactly mean? It's perhaps easy to spend a few vague generalities which sound great, but what does it really translate to personally for each of us? As a practicing litigator, one of the first things that I'm expected to ask, and as a former engineer, is what is the physical significance of a mathematical equation? What does it translate to? So what is the significance of all these words that are being thrown around? And why is this relevant to an educational institution of all the places? So on the way, I was just thinking of what is it that I must present to this audience. I could either present my personal journey and hold myself up as a role model, which I don't wish to because I'm far from it. Or I could present a broader template for you to work towards, a larger vision, which I think is what drives people who've been invited to this conclave, to this conference, including Mr. Jayashankar yesterday, Mr. Sanyal, and my dear friend Anand Ranganathan, who couldn't come here, fortunately for good reasons. He's been acquitted of the contempt case anyways. When you speak of Bharat Unleashed, in my small, limited head, I think of 3 C's. The first C being the master template or the background in which all of us trace our origins and identity, namely culture. The second C translates to consciousness, which has multiple ramifications. And the third C would be competence. So if I have to weave in each of these 3 C's for the purposes of a student, culturally inspired conscious competence is what I'm looking at. Why is this crucial? When we speak of making the transition from India to Bharat, it is a transition from being a lookalike or a duplicate to something that is original. So this fundamental thrust of anybody who speaks of Bharat is originality in thought. That is my thrust as far as my interpretation of Bharat goes. Now there are 2 ways of interpreting original. One is to reject everything that's foreign, or the alternative being, first draw from native thought as much as possible. And where you think foreign thought has contributed better to a particular subject or a particular issue, certainly be inspired by it, but also have the cultural consciousness to Indianize it, to indigenize it, without mechanically and, let's say, slavishly importing any particular idea. The tragedy of the last 70 years of so-called independent Bharat's journey is not lack of talent, but lack of original thought, which is the fount of all confidence for any civilization, for any culture, and any society. So it's impossible for an individual to think or assume that his individual confidence has got nothing to do with the confidence that the society enjoys and the very society that he comes from. You may be individually confident of your talent, so to speak, but when you represent a particular identity, especially a civilizational identity such as Bharatiya civilizational identity, you can't hope to have a certain identity or a certain confidence level which is completely independent of it, because the collective identity informs the individual identity and vice versa. Let's break this down for the engineering audience. What does this mean? If there is a certain problem which is commonly, which every civilization faces or which every society faces, what you bring to the table is not just your individual competence, but a certain pattern of thinking that is unique to the civilization that you come from. Which is one of the reasons I strongly believe that even individual competence is significantly inspired by the culture that you come from, which is why there's a Japanese way of thinking, there's a German way of thinking, there's a Swiss way of thinking, there's a Chinese way of thinking, there's an Israeli way of thinking. What is it that defines Bharatiya way of thinking is a question that we have not answered or even asked for the last 70 years. So if I have to look at the next 25 years, what is it that this journey must represent? What does it present to us as an opportunity in this historical time window? And because I'm in an educational institution, I have to make this statement. It is a re-education and a rediscovery and a reawakening of culture, consciousness, and competence, all three. The model of development that we currently subscribe to separates growth and sustainability, separates society and environment, which is one of the reasons that after having destroyed nature and civilization for at least 100 to 200 years, ever since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the Renaissance and whatnot, suddenly the West has woken up to the concept of sustainable development, something that native indigenous cultures and Eastern cultures have always been familiar with. So today, a culture such as Bharat, whose faith system revolves around nature, chooses to treat sustainable development as a separate topic altogether without connecting it with the question of growth and development. It doesn't reflect originality. It reflects the same slavish mechanical aping and imitation of the West. I see from the questions that have been given to me, one of the questions is, how do we get rid of colonial influences? Let me answer that question as part of my opening dialogue here. I don't think any of us should be looking at freeing ourselves from colonial influences. That is a display of irrational xenophobia. And if anybody thinks that is what I stand for or my message translates to, they're reading it wrong. I'm saying before you respect the rest of the world for the contributions that they have made to the pool of human thought, have the civilizational confidence to respect your community, your society, and your culture first. That's where I come from. Respect for the rest of the world is not mutually exclusive to respect for the self. I don't see this as a zero-sum game where one excludes the other or where one has to survive at the expense of the other. The way of the future is going to be more interdependence and more collaboration, but without losing what is unique to you, without forgetting where you come from. This is especially true in the world of science, because there is a certain glamour that is associated with the technological advancement of the West, that it's easy for people who come from this part of the world to forget their roots or even look down upon their roots simply because the last 500 years or let's say 300 years of history has not been particularly kind to us. And therefore, I have only 3 or 4 suggestions to offer to the members of this audience in the hope that this would create a multiplier effect when they go out of this room. 1, your identity needs to strike a balance between who you are as an individual and the society that you come from. Both of them must inform your entire identity. Neither is complete in itself. At a time when you're being constantly told that individual identity and individualism is the pinnacle of human civilization, those societies who have been governed by this thought process, their terminal decline is happening right in front of your eyes, simply because they are not in a position to regain that sense of community, which is crucial simply because it is a reality, it is a civilizational, evolutionary reality that a person or a human being or a man or a woman is a social animal. That sense of identity is being lost. So when you think of Bharat Unleashed, when you think of employability, when you think of sustainability, when you think of growth, when you think of entrepreneurship, the mistake that you will make is to look at them in compartments. They are all connected. Surely this city must stand testimony to the reality of what happens when development and blind development outpaces cultural heritage and respect for nature. Surely this state must have that consciousness, because this is perhaps the greenest possible state which has all the blessings of nature. And you can see the devastating transition that is happening right in front of your eyes when the same growth model of Bangalore is visiting other cities such as Mysore and second-tier cities of Karnataka. This is perhaps that time in history when we are poised to go ahead and hire, when we are equally being given an opportunity to hit reset on certain fundamental questions on how do we define growth, how do we define development. Can there be growth and development which is completely oblivious to its impact on nature and environment? I am not a Luddite, I am not anti-technology, I am an engineer myself, I practice in intellectual property, so this is as commercial an area of practice as it can get. And I say that, and I say this with a lot of responsibility. You might have the competence to create a fantastic drilling or boring machine that destroys mountains, but if you lack the consciousness and the civilizational, let's say, conscience to ask whether I should destroy nature in the first place, your competence will come back to kill everything else that you hold dear. So that is an example of a situation where myopic competence prevails over larger questions which affect everybody else. I'm certainly not in the realm of speculation or hypothesis when I say that issues such as climate change, water availability, and so on and so forth are going to animate the discussions for the next 25 to 30 years. That coincides with the 25 years you hope to be the period when Bharat rises again. So especially at a time when history is providing you with an opportunity to revive your roots and reclaim your lost glory, you're also going to be faced with those challenges which are crucial and which are existential. So you need to have answers to both. So my only suggestion is, it's easy to perhaps draw certain myopic, short-sighted lessons from YouTube reels and shorts which constantly float and create a personality cult around any individual. But no individual is bigger than the cause, and no individual is bigger than the society, no individual is bigger than the larger community. Competence can sometimes lead to a situation where your individual ego pushes you to the point of oblivion where you don't even know what is it that you're doing, where you're on such an ego high because you think you're so good at something that you don't realize the consequences of your actions on others. The story of development of the last 500 years is exactly that, where individual ego and human supremacism has come at the expense of environment. There is absolutely no respect for non-human beings in the current model of growth and development. I say this as a dog lover, as an animal lover. I say this as someone who equally believes that crackers must be burst on Diwali, but with responsibility. I am not anti-science. I am not anti-progress. I am not anti-development. But I think it's important to learn certain important lessons. And the best part of being a Bharatiya is that you don't need to learn these lessons from the West. Your culture, your civilization has always respected Prakriti, because there is no dharma without Prakriti. I have 4.5 minutes left. I'll just take some time to share an experience that I recently had. In August of this year, I had the good fortune of being in the Sannidhi of the Sringeri Acharyas. And there I also happened to visit the research center called the Advaita Research Center, ARC. I'm dropping names simply because you know that this is not some taxi driver story that a journalist created to push a political propaganda. These are real stories. So as part of my visit to that center, I came across a young scholar who basically hails from Andhra Pradesh, unfortunately divided Andhra Pradesh, who was sporting the shikha, the sacred tuft of hair, spoke perhaps in crisp English, was wearing the traditional attire, was a qualified or is a qualified aerospace engineer from the United States, who's grown up in the United States, has given up all of that to pursue Indic research in Sringeri. And his area of research happens to be principles of environmentalism that can be culled out from Arthashastra. His name, I think, is Lalitaditya. Fantastic name. Of the Karkota dynasty of Kashmir. That's where the name comes from. So this gentleman was looking at principles of environmentalism from Arthashastra, where Chanakya or Kautilya or Vishnugupta is specifying how do you use environment or a forest for military purposes, for espionage, for dharmic purposes, for environmental purposes, and for commercial purposes. One of the prescriptions, and perhaps an inbuilt proscription or a prohibition, is that you will not destroy an existing forest for commercial purposes. You must create a forest for it to be used for commercial purposes. So you must buy land, create a forest, so that you know what is the pain it takes to create a forest in the first place, the time that is consumed, before you fell a tree with quickening ease. That is the lesson that Chanakya teaches. There are enough and more principles to draw from. Why is it that it's important for you to know this about your culture? Because each time a so-called new idea presents itself, the person who receives that new idea is not only surprised or is not only expressing awe at that particular idea, he thinks, oh, the culture this idea has come from must be a superior culture to mine. That is the subconscious train of thought that goes on in people's heads, fortunately or unfortunately so. So when people realize that this is the height of thought that this civilization has produced, is capable of producing, and the gods willing in plural will continue to be capable of producing, I think it does a lot to your confidence as an individual. So my request to you is, as much as you pursue your career as an engineer, I say this as an engineer who's transitioned to perhaps as humanitarian a subject as possible, which is law. Do not see engineering and humanities and the arts in silos. A lot of people who come from the science stream have a certain ego where they look down upon people who come from the liberal arts. Remember, you work, but policy will always be set by people who are from the humanities. So you will earn, but the person who decides how you shall spend and how much you shall spend will not be a person who's from your stream. So respect that area and find a way, and my suggestion to this institution which has done so much is to find a way to destroy these walls which separate multiple areas as if they are meant to be learnt in compartments. Since we speak of Bharat Unleashed, the way of the future is to have people who are as competent when it comes to culture as they are in engineering, and who are equally qualified. So perhaps the way of the future is offering multiple majors in what seems like diametrically opposite areas of specialization. That is the only way you create a mind that has more humility, that understands it doesn't know everything, and is open to ideas from everybody else. Vande Mataram, Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. We would like to request you to stay back for the question and answer session. Now, let's dive into the exciting part we've all been waiting for. We have some questions from the students of PES University.
So, the first question, how can the Uniform Civil Code framework be adapted to accommodate India's diverse socio-legal landscape?
You can't hope to speak of diversity with uniform being present in the word. I say this as someone whose ideological inclinations and proclivities are out in the public domain. Nothing is hidden. But understanding the somber and the sober nature of the environment and the platform, I'll try and keep this as less controversial as possible. Contrary to my nature. One, as long as this conversation happens for the sake of political tokenage and symbolism, I think this conversation will be a truncated, moth-eaten conversation, to put it in the language of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. That was his word for Pakistan when it was given to him in Dole. You need a much more informed societal conversation before you embark upon the concept of a uniform civil code. And I say this as a proud Sanatani. So that my allegiance to my community and my civilization is certainly not called into question. In the interest of preserving the inherent organic diversity of the Sanatani civilization, it is much more incumbent upon the adherents of the civilization and its faith systems to ask serious questions on what is the meaning of a uniform civil code, what is it meant to achieve, and if there are other ways of achieving what it is meant to achieve, why do we need a uniform civil code? Because when you present something as a solution, the first thing that an engineer is supposed to ask is, are there no alternative solutions? That's what I would ask. So don't buy anything lock, stock and barrel just because it's being presented as a vision statement for anybody. Take a step back. The assumption is that members of this audience belong to that thinking section of the society that will not vote for a bottle of alcohol or a packet of biryani. So take a step back. Ask some serious questions. Ask the fundamental question, what is the impact of a particular solution that's being proposed on me, my society, and generations of practices that we have preserved and we have died and fought to preserve? That's a question that we must ask. Yes.
Thank you for your response, sir. The next question. From the Sabarimala judgment to the verdict on same-sex marriages, how do we balance the social and cultural sensitivity of India while dealing with such cases?
There appears to be an assumption in the question that there is something common across each of those issues. Every issue is different. But perhaps what is common is the assumption in each of those issues that an individual's ego and arrogance must prevail over an institution. When someone says, I don't care for the practices of an institution, I don't care for the faith system and the sentiments associated with the institution, which have been followed for generations and millennia, and my individual right must prevail over that, it's a textbook example of the point I was making 15 minutes ago. Coming to the question of same-sex marriage, I've said this very clearly. The concept of a Tritiya Prakriti is something that Hindu civilization and Hindu thought has always recognized. And it has asked itself a few hard questions. I need to do justice to somebody's right to exist and to exist with dignity. And I also need to ensure that the institution which is meant for continuity of civilization, namely the family, remains unaffected. So how do I strike a balance between both? It's easy to ask a question which requires you to take a binary position. It's much more difficult to actually take a position which is more balanced. I genuinely believe that a balance can be struck between both these positions and both these expectations, provided this conversation happens in the heart of the society and not before 5 people who represent a particular institution with absolutely no societal inputs. So my fundamental position before the court, which was the position before the proceedings began and after, has always been, I think the question of dignity and the question of respect is a non-negotiable. But from there, where does it go, is a question for the parliament to ask because it represents the will of the people. You cannot expect an unelected body, and you should not allow an unelected body to answer these questions, because that would be in violation of the constitution, and it also takes away the fundamental right of the society to participate in the discussion. When 5 people take the decision without any input from the society, you have to ask yourself the larger question, what does it do to the concept of democracy on such an important societal, familial, and let's say civilizational question? Unfortunately, mainstream media doesn't have patience for these nuances, so every position is typically painted in a 0 or 1 fashion, which it is never. Next.
Thank you for your response, sir.
Just so that the audience knows, I got the questions only once the program began. This is not a scripted interview. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes.
Coming to the next question. Speaking of men's rights in the horizon, when can we expect a national commission for men addressing their specific concerns?
Wonderfully mischievous question, which is meant to break my resolve to not make this controversial. I would rather ask, when would we arrive at a situation when we don't have a national commission for women? That question is not rhetorical, it is not misogynistic. I'm asking, when do we arrive at a situation when the need for a special commission to protect the rights of a particular gender is made useless? When do we arrive at that? That perhaps is the larger question. Otherwise, and I think it's very important that I answer the question slightly differently also. when genders fight for supremacy, frankly, it is the society that is the first casualty, because it is a race to competitive victimhood, which is always a race to the bottom. Because you're fighting for who is the bigger victim. When the fact of the matter is the bigger victim will always be the familial institution when genders fight. Next.
Considering the next question was already answered in your keynote speech, we'll be moving on. Right to publicity versus right to personality. What's your take on providing protection to personality rights of copyright in India?
It's a question that is too specific for the nature of this event. It goes back to my home turf, which is intellectual property rights. I'm giving you an opportunity to ask a question which is broader. So rephrase the question or ask another question, I'll wait for it. Because this question doesn't take the conversation forward. This is going in one track, it's a separate track altogether.
All right. Thank you, sir. We'll move on to the last question.
Yes.
A strong foundation for a stronger India. What should be the role of institutions such as PES University in promoting legal education in India?
I was on the way to the institution here. I had a conversation with the Shailashri madam on my limited suggestions on legal education. I'll answer the question, the larger question of education, and then come to legal education. I'll just take 2 minutes. I think that's the time I have. One, the fight for Bharat's soul is fundamentally a fight for education. The battleground is education. Because that is where minds are shaped, hearts are forged. And perhaps I can make this statement, which is people are not taught, they're indoctrinated. So the fight on the so-called Indic Renaissance, or whatever we call it, is all about the right to teach truth and facts based on material, which is not meant to paint a jingoistic picture of the civilization, but at the very least, not a self-loathing, denigrating picture of the civilization. So that is the larger battle. And I hope institutions such as the PES, who happen to be fortunately located in this great state of Karnataka, with all the blessings of the divine which have been showered on this state, on this people, take upon themselves the duty and the responsibility of contributing confidently to this conversation. Because allow me to say this, diplomacy in such conversations will not work. Because these are conversations which are do or die. They make or mar the future. And I don't see the point in mincing words when it comes to such a crucial issue. Now, coming to the question of legal education, as self-defeating as it sounds as a practicing litigator, one, a country which is interested in becoming one of the world's foremost economies must produce more people who make than more people who talk. So, produce lawyers, for sure. Produce quality lawyers as opposed to quantity lawyers. That's one. Two, I think legal education in this country needs a serious overhaul. And one of my criticisms of the NEP was that there was absolutely no thought or energy spent in Bharatizing Indian legal education. Hindu legal philosophy, so to speak, is limited only to succession and Hindu law. It does not feature anywhere as part of our education on political systems and political thought. Law is the last mile, political thought is the first mile, and the first mile is nowhere covered as part of Indian legal education. So, I would genuinely hope that as opposed to teaching Western content in Indian languages, Bharatiya languages, we start with teaching Bharatiya content in Bharatiya, or let's say Western languages, and then move to teaching Bharatiya content in Bharatiya languages. I understand it's a long shot, but if you're aiming, you might as well aim high.